everyone, and welcome to our Brown Bag Lunch with Dr. Ethelene Whitmire, which is sponsored by the Danish Sisterhood Lodge number 15. I'm Dia Nagaraj, the Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Museum of Danish America, and Dr. Whitmire is a professor at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'll pass it over to her and let her introduce herself and her research.
Hi, my name is Ethelene Whitmire. I'm the professor and chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Wisconsin. And I'm actually working on two books. The main book is called, well, doesn't have an exact title, but it's about African Americans in Denmark in the 20th century. And I'm looking at all sorts of African Americans who went there, students, performers, journalists, educators, and I'm writing about them. But now I have an agent and she wants me to focus on one particular story. The book is actually filled with so many stories that could be a standalone book, but there was one story that I wrote about in an article for Narratively about Reed Pegram, an African-American man working on his PhD at Harvard. He went to Paris. During pre-World War II, he met a Danish man he fell in love with, and they decided to stay together and ended up being captured by the Nazis. And it's just a fascinating, somewhat heartbreaking story about this love. And so I'm working on that book too, and that will probably come out before the book about African Americans in Denmark, but Reed Pegram is one of the people in the study. And so that's my the main projects I'm working on.
That sounds really fascinating and such a heartbreaking and yet really interesting and important story of their relationship and that time period in history. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. And thank you to everybody who sent in questions. The questions are a mixture of ones that were sent in from our audience, some of my own, and then some other staff members also had some questions. So I think we'll touch on a lot of really interesting topics today. So what first sparked your interest and drew you to this particular subject?
I get this question a lot. Like, what about African Americans in Denmark? I actually was on a sabbatical from my job as a professor in 2009, 2010 academic year. And it was about to end. It seemed very boring. I wanted to travel. I was writing a book and I was going to go on a writing retreat and I wanted to go to another country. And I picked Denmark because I was watching a lot of Danish films. I started watching After the Wedding by Suzanne Bier, starring Mads Mikkelsen, and I really loved that. And then I started watching other films with the two of them, one directing, one starring in, and then just films she directed that he wasn't in, or films he was in that she wasn't directing. And I just watched a lot of Danish films and decided to go to Denmark, sight unseen, didn't know a soul there, didn't know if they spoke English, didn't realize how expensive it was, but I decided to go for 2 months, and I think it was May and June of 2010, and I loved it, fell in love with it, and I've continued to go back, I guess 13 more times. So
wow.
I've been there a lot over the last decade, except for 2020 because of obvious reasons.
Unfortunately, I think COVID put a lot of travel plans on hold.
And, I should say, so while I was working on this one book, one summer I was staying in Norbro section, and I would cut through Assistens Kierkegaard, the famous cemetery where Hans Christian Andersen's buried, and Soren Kierkegaard, the philosopher. And I came across the grave of Ben Webster, and I knew he wasn't Danish. So I looked him up and found out he's one of many African Americans who went there to Copenhagen, died there, buried there. And I heard other stories about African Americans while I was going there over the 10 years. And I decided to write a book about them because it felt like it was a story that hasn't been told.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I can speak for myself when I say I was really unaware of how deep and rich that history was until reading your research and hearing about your work. Why do you think Denmark appealed to so many African Americans, despite the country's association with the slave trade and colonization of areas like what is now today the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Yeah, it's even hard for me to put a finger on why I'm interested. And I think a lot of the people in my study also said the same thing. They just went to Denmark and loved it. They liked the people, they liked the freedom there. And I think most of them were like me, who have no idea about the slave trade. Or I've heard of the U.S. Virgin Islands and I heard of the Danish West Indies. I had no idea that they were the same. I knew nothing about the U.S. Virgin Islands. I couldn't have named them a few years ago. I would have said, no, St. Croix is French. Why would that be a U.S. Virgin Island? But of course it is. And I was there in Denmark for an academic year as a Fulbright scholar in 2016, 2017. And in 2017, Denmark was reconciling their colonial past for the anniversary of the sale of their islands to the United States on March 31st of 1917. It was the 100th anniversary. And they used that to talk about it. I think a lot of Danish people didn't know that they were part of the slave trade. Again, and a lot of Americans were unfamiliar when I was posting stuff. A lot of my friends are highly educated. Apparently, I hang out with a lot of professors, and a lot of them did not know about this whole history. And part of it is because the enslaved people they had stayed on the islands, and they weren't in Denmark. And so there aren't a lot of Black people walking around who are descendants of the people who were enslaved. And so I guess there could be some deniability or just lack of awareness because of that. So, African Americans are in America, which has a colonial past. And so I don't know if that would have factored in to whether or not they went to Denmark, but people just loved it. They liked how they were welcomed. They felt a freedom there. And one man, Shahib Shahab, a jazz musician, he thought maybe it was because he was there briefly once, and then he went back again and just really loved it and ended up living in Denmark. There's something intangible that I really can't quite define, even after all these years of research.
That's incredible. And what was the role of the Danish government in supporting or trying to minimize this trend of African Americans coming into the country for short periods or to live there?
Yeah, I don't know if the Danish government played much of a role, except for people who wanted to stay a little longer past the restrictions of a non-resident. There were two people in particular, Roy de Coverley, who technically was a Jamaican. In the 1930s, he was a British descendant, but he asked to stay longer. And for some reason, they allowed him to stay for several years. He only left because of World War II. And then later, there's another journalist in the 1960s. He was there for a few months and asked to stay, and they allowed him to. But generally, the government didn't play much of a part, except for the jazz musicians who lived there for a long time. The Danish government helped to support the arts, in particular the jazz clubs. And so they would subsidize funding for the jazz clubs, and that would allow the African Americans to perform there, and also apparently granted them visas to live there, because many, again, lived there for decades, died there. A few of them became Danish citizens because they spent more of their life in Denmark. And so I think the support for the arts through the Danish government really helped them financially. Though they did put on restrictions. If you were hiring foreigners, you also had to hire an equal number of Danish musicians. But it was a good relationship between the Danish musicians and African Americans, who were usually older, more experienced, and so they would provide training for the younger musicians.
And speaking of musicians, it seems that even a welcoming society had preconceived notions about the new immigrants. For example, surprise at seeing an African American performing classical music. Could you talk a little bit more about the role that stereotypes played in these cross-cultural interactions?
Yeah, I can think of a few stories, but one in particular, again, in the 1930s, Roy de Coverley, the journalist, he befriended an African-American woman, Thyra J. Edwards, who was studying at the still existing International People's College in Elsinore. And they were hanging out with a Danish man, Carl Larsen, all the time. And Carl Larsen actually said to them after a while, you're just like anyone else. You know, I heard all these stereotypes about what Black people would be like, and you're the same. You're interested in culture and politics, and he was kind of amazed. And Thyra Edwards wrote this in a letter to a friend. The Danish people over the century that I'm covering, they often wanted to know more about African American history and culture. Some students who were studying there, they wrote to Crisis magazine, part of the NAACP, asking for some more issues. They said people want to know what it's like to be African American. I was surprised when I looked at Danish newspapers that they were covering things that were going on in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement, various and they actually invited people over to give talks, people at the US Embassy, some of them African-American men in the 60s and 70s also went over and to the colleges and gave talks. So they were very interested in this, but I think they were surprised, probably like Americans too, that a Black man, I think you're talking about Eugene, oh my goodness, why is his name blanking? I have so many people in my study. But there was a classical musician who went to Juilliard, and he had a trouble finding jobs. And this is in the 1950s, 1960s in the United States. And so when he was in Denmark, he was able to go around and actually perform. But I mean, he's been long dead. He lived in Drower. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And when I was there recently, I ran into a woman, a librarian, and she says, "Oh, I remember him. He's a jazz musician." And I said, "No, he's a classical musician. He's probably turning in his grave because everyone assumed he played jazz." But she still looked at me very skeptically, like she didn't believe me, like I knew what I was talking about. So this is in, the 21st century. I think just going to Denmark is kind of unusual too. I think a lot of the African Americans like being one of few. They liked going somewhere different where a lot of Black people weren't going. They liked to find these stereotypes of what places people will go to.
Mm. Yeah. And were African Americans treated differently than other Black people within Denmark or other immigrants of color?
Yeah, historically, the people who were there didn't talk much about the other Black people too much. They talked about the African Americans, but just doing this research and looking at African Americans who travel all over the world, or also looking at Denmark now in the 21st century, you hear stories of African Americans being welcome because they're Americans. Often if you're traveling abroad, you must have some wealth, some education. And so you're a more desirable tourist or even immigrant, and you're often not even called an immigrant, you're called an expat. If you're from a Western society and you're living in another country. But people who are born and raised in these countries who are of Black descent often aren't treated very well. I'm teaching African Americans Abroad course this semester, and we were looking at France and Langston Hughes and James Baldwin going there. And we're looking at modern day France where, even back then when they were there in the 30s and 50s and the 20s, people weren't treated very well if they were African immigrants. So we were comparing and contrasting. Or not even immigrants, they could be children who are first generation born there. They're often not treated very well in the same way. And so that's where you see a disconnect. And I think a lot of African Americans recognize the privilege of just having this passport, this blue passport, and being able to travel.
It's incredible kind of how that impression of Americans can kind of benefit or hurt people.
Yeah, and it's also a paradox with African Americans who often aren't treated very well in their own country here, and they feel like they're treated very well when they go abroad, or people see them as an American, where even in America, I think they recognize African Americans as Americans, but still there's a lot of negativity around it in terms of our rights or how we're treated, so.
Right. And speaking of this racism, Denmark was not free of racism, of course, during the time period that you discuss. And you state that not everyone found their utopia in Denmark. Could you expand a little bit on that and some of those stories?
Yeah, I think overall, most people are very satisfied when they were there. They stayed there and died there at birth. Some of them, one man in particular, Skip Malone, one of the journalists, he said, "It's hard for me to complain if I'm not treated well because this is not even my country. I put myself in this situation." And so I think it's a little different when you're treated poorly in another country versus your own country too. But most people seem satisfied. Maybe that quote is from one musician who went over, tried to perform. He said the first few years, it was pretty good, and then decided to go back. But very few returned. Most of the jazz musicians stayed. And so after a while, people said it's okay, but they like living there, but it might not be perfect. Nowadays, you hear about issues of racism in terms of employment and also finding housing difficult for Black people, whether Americans or people who are Black Danes or Afro Danes. So those are some issues where it's not really utopian today. But in the past, the same guy, Skip Malone, said when he was looking for housing, the landlord offered to lower the rent. They really wanted to rent to him. This is in the 1960s, because I guess he thought he was interesting or exotic to have as a tenant. And he said versus being in America where it was hard to rent in certain places where they wanted even offer you a place to live. So So it's different. There's no place is perfect, whether America or Denmark, but people found their happiness one way or the other.
That contrast is really interesting to think about, especially in the 60s, which when you think of America in the 60s and then hear that story of him, a tenant or a landlord thinking he was such a desirable tenant.
Right.
It's a really interesting contrast there.
Yeah.
How did Denmark change throughout the 20th century in terms of the experiences of African Americans?
I think in the early 20th century, there were very few, and it was unusual to see African American in Denmark. When Booker T. Washington went in 1910, all these people showed up to see him at the train station and interview him, and the newspaper coverage, they were talking about his skin tone and color, and it just seemed very fascinating. And I heard from people that they would get stared at through the early 1970s, but now there's so many people, it's so much more diverse, at least in Copenhagen itself, that I think it's not unusual to see people of color. I've taught there twice during the summer and brought students from the University of Wisconsin, predominantly Black students, and they said walking around they felt very free. No one was staring at them. And one group, the first year I took them in 2018, started counting all the Black people they saw. I think they got up to around 300 or so. I said, are you counting the same people? But they swear they weren't. One woman was biracial, and so I guess she was checking to make sure that she was recognizing people who were definitely Black. But I think the difference is that there's an increased amount of African Americans there now, either visiting or also living there than in the past. So it's changed in that way.
And one thing that you just touched on in that question is, I know you've spent a significant amount of time in Denmark over the past several years and you've taken students over there. Could you speak a little bit about your personal experiences with it? How do you feel your experiences compare to those that you write about in your research?
Yeah, so it's a different time, but again, I started feeling the same way they did. I just loved it. I went there for 2 months and then went back the following January, and went back many other Januaries every summer. I felt like, I don't know, people were nice and friendly, but they also left me alone, because a lot of my friends say, how is Denmark different from living in Wisconsin where I live, which is a predominantly white university and also a state. But I said, the Danes often will leave me alone, or also they might not have the stereotypes of what and who African Americans are, or the fact that I'm sitting there in Denmark again might indicate I might have some money, I might be educated. And so I've had great experiences meeting very interesting people there through all my visits, whether they're artists, a lot of artists for some reason, educators, just fascinating. But I also found the more people have traveled abroad or have those experiences, the more open they were to meeting African Americans. Maybe I just hang out with a lot of liberal, radical people too. I just find that to be very interesting. And so that's why I wanted to bring students to come and see the culture. I find it very laid back. I try to incorporate some of the cultural aspects of the Danes into my life too, in terms of maybe not working, not to say they don't work hard, but just, in the evenings relax, on the weekends relax. You can't see, but I have a little white candle that I burn to get a little hygge. Like able skiers or evil skiers, but not just for Christmas, because I'm not Danish, so I feel like you should eat those year round. But yeah, I just like the experience being there. I can't even explain it again. I can't put my finger on it, but my experiences have been positive. Obviously, that's why I keep returning all the time.
It's wonderful. And bringing this into the present day in your research, obviously we've had a lot of global conversations about race for many years, but particularly this summer. This is a really, really broad question that deserves a discussion of its own. But how is Denmark viewed today in terms of racial equity by American and or Danish Black people?
I'm not sure how much Americans know about Denmark. Even the students in my class, they said, why don't we know anything about this country? I think there's about 25 students in the class. None of them had ever been there. My Black friends in America often ask, well, how many Black people are there? What is it like over there? There's no sense of it. But meeting Black people in Denmark, some of them call themselves Afro-Danes, though some Danish people say, don't call them Afro-Danes. We're all just Danish. We're all one. But I don't know if the people, the Black people feel that the same way. They feel this oneness. So when I was there for 2016, 2017, there was a meeting where they invited one of the founders of Black Lives Matter to come and talk to groups. And then afterwards, the various groups met together to try to form some kind of coalition or just to have a discussion. And so there seems to be a movement, whether it's with artists, like the ones who created the I Am Queen Mary statue there in Copenhagen, the first one representing a Black person, or there's a lot of young people who are, whether they're poets, they formed a group called Marinage. They are talking about their own experiences in Denmark as Black people, or some of them are people of color, you would say. For example, one of the leaders, he's now in England studying for a degree. And he said this is the first time he's ever had a Black professor or a teacher in any capacity. You know, he didn't have that growing up in Denmark. So there's a movement, there's a Black Lives Matter movement in Denmark, just like there were all over the world during last summer. Since I can't go to Denmark, I just follow on social media, but there were at least 2 marches from the US Embassy to the Parliament. And I was shocked by the staggering number of people who were there. There's a dispute about how many people were there, but it was large. And it wasn't just Black people. There were also white Danes who were there, but there were 2 of these. And so I think there's a reckoning, there's a realization that you need to address some of these issues in Denmark, that, you know, the young generation, they're more outspoken than in the past. They're starting to find their voice.
That's wonderful that young people are feeling empowered to kind of take action and make their voices heard.
Absolutely, absolutely. And a lot of them are trying to go to college and study these things and get educated about it. And I think there's going to be a lot of interesting work that's going to come out over the next several years, whether by artists or also by academics, and then regular people and activists.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today and for being a part of this conversation that I think is really interesting, important, and relevant. And I'm looking forward to reading your publications when they come out.
Was it over already? Oh no.
I know I would be happy to talk for another, 2 hours on this subject.
But people can feel free to contact me if they have any questions or comments, or sometimes I get good hints about other people to include in the book. Or people have information. I would love to hear from people.
We'll make sure that we put your contact information on screen so that everybody who's interested can reach out and learn more. Thank you.
And follow me on Instagram. Well, when I'm in Denmark, I try to post photos as I follow in the footsteps of people and conduct my research. So you can follow along.
Oh, wonderful. We'll definitely put all the handles right there.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for talking to us.